Good afternoon and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we're joined by Richard Comstock and Dr. Richard Barbuto for our program, December 1813, the Fall of Fort Niagara and the Burning of the Niagara Frontier. Richard Comstock, Lieutenant Colonel retired, is a steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. He spent 4 years on active duty with the U.S. Army, which included tours of duty in Vietnam and Korea. Richard was also a member of the New York Army National Guard and retired in 1990 after having spent the last 4 years commanding the 1st Battalion, 258th Field Artillery. Richard was also a tax partner with Arthur Anderson, subsequently a partner at Deloitte, and finally was managing director tax at MBIA, where he retired in 2017. He currently consults on tax matters and is on the board of various not-for-profit organizations. Richard Barbuto is Professor Emeritus of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Richard is a graduate of West Point and served for 23 years on active duty as an armor officer. He is a two-time Larry J. Hackman Research Residency Award recipient in 2006 and 2009, and author of New York's War of 1812, Politics, Society, and Combat, Niagara 1814. Niagara 1814, America Invades Canada, and Long Range Guns, Close Quarter Combat, the 3rd United States Artillery Regiment in the War of 1812. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So for those of you who have joined us today, feel free to submit questions using the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And now I am pleased to hand it off to Richard Comstock.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased and both pleased and honored to be able to participate in today's program, which is a discussion of a portion of Richard Barbuto's, what I consider excellent work, that is the War of 1812, New York's War of 1812. When I first was asked to participate, I had to scratch my head and say, how much do I really know about the War of 1812? And I did know that my local Barnes & Noble didn't have much in its military history section on the War of 1812, but I did know that there was more to it than simply 2 quotes, "Don't give up the ship," and "We have met the enemy and they are ours," more than just the burning of the White House or Andrew Jackson's Battle of New Orleans. So this was an opportunity for me to learn a whole lot more about a very interesting war. And after reading Richard's book, I've become very interested in the war, not only in terms of its waging of the war, but also in terms of the impact of the social and political landscape of our country in that era. I think Richard's done a great job of personalizing the war and have really focused on New York State, its people, its geography, and the leadership involved and difficulties involved in managing the first war declared by the United States. So I think that without further ado, I want to task Richard with a question. That is, what prompted you to write the book?
Richard, thank you very much, and thank you for those kind words. I'll answer your question and start here. My first book 20 years ago, which was my dissertation, was Niagara 1814, America Invades Canada. And that was about the 1814 campaign with the battles of Chippewa and Lundy's Lane and the siege of Fort Erie. But what started that was the commentary I received from the soldiers who were moving back to the Buffalo area, and they saw the scenes of destruction. And I read a lot of commentary, but one in particular stands out. And this is a drummer in Winfield Scott's brigade. And he writes in his journal this: "When we came there and saw the smoldering ruins, it gave us feelings of deep sympathy for the desolate and plundered inhabitants, and sharpened up our courage to prepare for effectual retaliation when we should enter Canada upon the anticipated campaign." So there's a feeling of retaliation among the soldiers, the American soldiers, when they see the burned Niagara Frontier. So let's talk a little bit about that war and how we got to the burning. Madison asked Congress to declare war in the summer of 1812. And his war aims were these. He wanted to persuade Britain to respect neutral shipping rights. Both Britain and France had seized hundreds and hundreds of American ships and cargoes over the past few years. He wanted to stop Britain from impressing or drafting American sailors. Royal Navy captains would stop an American vessel, have the crew stand up, and if any of them were born in the United Kingdom, they were then brought onto the British warship for service there for the remainder of the war. And to stop Britain from inciting the Indians. The Indians were pushing back on westward expansion, and in doing so, they had been armed by the British authorities up in Canada. Now, Madison knew that Britain was locked in an existential conflict with France, and all of its treasure and all of its resources were fighting Napoleon and his armies. So Madison saw a window of opportunity that perhaps he could seize Canada and then trade it back in negotiations for those three concessions. But failing that, he was going to retain Canada. A quick look at the geography of the Niagara Frontier. We see the New York on the right, Upper Canada or Ontario on the left. The Niagara River is emptying the waters of Lake Erie into Lake Ontario. The dotted line is the Niagara Escarpment. And at Queenston, Lewiston, this escarpment is basically 180 feet high above Queenston and Lewiston. So it's quite an elevation. And the land is pretty much flat on both sides of the border. However, in 1812, it is just covered with woodlands. Now, I want you to notice at the top of the Niagara, we see Fort Niagara, and we see on the Canadian side, the village of Newark and Fort George. And at the bottom of the Niagara River, in New York, we see the villages of Black Rock and Buffalo, and across the river from them is Fort Erie. And all of these are going to figure into this story. We're going to talk about three people in particular and see how the burning of Buffalo is reflected through the eyes of Dr. Serenius Chapin, Betsy Doyle, and Joseph Wilcox. Now let's look at Serenius Chapin. He's a doctor. He actually practiced in the village of Newark for a while, but when war started in 1812, he and a small group of civilians joined a naval and army raid to cut out the brigs Caledonia and Detroit that are anchored off of Buffalo. And they do that successfully. So Chapin for a doctor, establishes quite a bit of a military reputation. The following year, Chapin puts together a group of volunteers who are mounted, and they cross the river and raid up and down through the Niagara Frontier on the Canadian side, intimidating the people, and if they find any militia officers, they're taking him prisoner and bringing him back to New York. But in 1813, he's at the Battle of Beaver Dams, and he's captured. And the British know they finally stopped Chapin and his 40 thieves. So they throw him and his men into boats to cross Lake Ontario to go to York, which is present-day Toronto. But Chapin signals his men, they overthrow their guards, turn the tables on them, and bring them as prisoners back to New York. So Chapin has quite a military career. Betsy Doyle is a laundress in the 1st Artillery Regiment. Now, in those days, the laundress was not paid, but they are on the company rolls. They're on the roster, and she will get rations. But she will be paid for all the soldiers who use her to launder their clothing and to if there's any sewing that needs to be done to do that. So she can make a living there. And since she's on the rolls of the regiment takes responsibility for her. Now, Betsy Doyle is the Molly Pitcher of the War of 1812. And this lady really hasn't gotten a great press, but we're finding out more about her all the time. Her husband is captured at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October of 1812, and he's shipped off to a prisoner of war camp in Dartmoor, England. A month later, there's a big bombardment between Fort Niagara and Fort George. They're about 1,000 yards across the river from one another. The Americans have got a 6-pounder gun up on the top floor of the French castle, and they've got a furnace at the ground level. The furnace is burning the shot, red hot shot, and Betsy Doyle is carrying it in tongs, one at a time, up those stairs and giving it to the gun crew, who then fire the hot shot into Fort George, and they set buildings on fire. And she's doing this basically all day. So she's got quite the reputation now as, again, as the Molly Pitcher of this new conflict. And a young lieutenant, Lieutenant William Jenkins Worth, he's at Fort Niagara, and he and his fellow lieutenants want to meet Betsy Doyle. And he records in his journal this: "Our curiosity was all impatience to see this sort of Joan of Arc. The younger part of us at once investing her in our imaginations with all of the reputed charms of the Gallic Amazon. She was accordingly summoned to the roof, and we were sadly disappointed when we found the reality better answering the description of Meg Merrilies rather than that of the Maid of Orleans." Now, Meg Merrilies is a Sir Walter Scott character. She's a crone living in a forest and is supposed to have magical powers. Now, William Jenkins Worth is a callow youth at 19 years old, but he becomes a bit of a war hero in the war with Mexico, and Fort Worth, Texas, is named after young Lieutenant William Jenkins Worth. General McClure, born in Ireland, comes to New York, rises in local politics, joins a militia organization, and in 1813, Governor Daniel Tompkins appoints him a brigadier general, gives him a brigade of over 2,000 militiamen, and sends him to the Fort George area. By now, the Americans have captured Fort George, and it needed to be garrisoned. But these militia are there for 3 months, and their service started on 9 September. This is important because 90 days later, these militia are going to expect to be paid and to be able to go home. It's tough duty on the Niagara Frontier. Now, Governor Tompkins gets word that the regulars at Fort George are going to leave the Niagara Frontier and go off to Sackett's Harbor on a campaign to capture Montreal. So he writes to McClure, and one of his sentences is this: "Your command will then become doubly delicate and responsible and will require the exertion of your utmost vigilance and talents, because McClure is going to be the ranking officer and in command of both regulars and militia to defend Fort George." Enter Joseph Wilcox, also born in Ireland. He immigrates to Canada, living in Toronto initially. He's appointed sheriff of the counties around York, but he's relieved of command. He's a real liberal and a thorn in the side of the British authorities. He moves to the village of Newark. The locals called it Niagara. Today we call it Niagara on the Lake. And he starts a newspaper there, and it's a liberal newspaper. He's elected by the people into the Legislative Assembly, but because of his various speeches, he's jailed for contempt, and he's eventually released. Now, Wilcox is present at the Battle of Queenston Heights on the British side, of course, but something happens to him between 1812 and 1813. And in 1813, he switches sides. He puts together a group of volunteers, Canadian people, soldiers, brings them over to New York, and they serve as volunteers in the US Army. And they're really quite valuable to the Army because they know all the roads, the villages, the people in Canada close to the Niagara River. So they basically act as scouts during the war. And now we're getting close to the actual destruction of the Niagara Frontier. The regulars are shipping out. Fort George is in the hands of the militia. And the Secretary of War sends General McClure orders. And one of the paragraphs is this: "Understanding that the defense of the post committed to your charge," he's talking about Fort George, "may render it proper to destroy the town of Newark. You are hereby directed to apprise its inhabitants of the circumstance and advise them to remove themselves and their effects to some greater place of greater safety." Two things here. First, it's if you need to take down the village so it doesn't provide shelter to the British troops because you are going to defend Fort George, you have authority to burn it. And second, please make every effort to make sure the civilians get out of Newark. Now, the civilians there are women and children and elderly men. All the people of militia age have left the area. Now, in October, General Peter B. Porter, General McClure, and Serenius Chapin take the militia and they move out to 12 Mile Creek, which is 12 miles to the west of Fort George. They're trying to keep the British away from Fort George. Colonel Winfield Scott, who is the ranking regular Army officer, writes to the Secretary of War. And in this letter, he says, there is no danger of their coming up with the enemy, or they would be in great danger of a total annihilation. Winfield Scott thinks the British are too far away and they're no longer a threat to Fort George. And he also holds the militia in tremendously poor regard. Now, Lieutenant William Rochester, he's a militia officer. His dad is one of the founders of the city of Rochester. He writes this, and a sentence in his letter is, there are about 800 militia here who are completely raw, untrained, and lawless. And then Winfield Scott takes the remaining regulars under his command, a battalion of artillerists, and he abandons Fort George and moves his command to Sackett's Harbor to participate in the campaign to take Montreal. So the regulars left on the Niagara Frontier are a few hundred in Fort Niagara and a handful in Buffalo. So now the defense of the frontier is up to the militia. Now, the day after the militia is supposed to be released, McClure is persuaded by Joseph Wilcox to burn the village down, even though McClure's intent is to abandon Fort George. So he's violating his orders, but he writes a letter to the Secretary of War and he says, the village of Newark is now in flames. The few remaining inhabitants of it, having been notified of our intention, were enabled to remove their property. Well, Chapin is along with him, and he sees that it's Wilcox and McClure who've decided to burn the village. Chapin has to live in the Buffalo area. He knows that after the war is over, the Canadians are going to be his neighbors again. And he writes in a newspaper article, actually, women and children were turned out of doors in a cold and stormy night. The cries of infants, the decrepitude of age, the debility of sickness had no impression upon this monster in human shape. And he's referring to General McClure. Well, now he abandons Fort George and he moves his command into Fort Niagara, and then the vast majority of his militiamen are released from service. They head to their homes, and there are no other militiamen who should have been there to take their place. The militia was slow to get together in December. They're on the march, but they're not there yet. So there's even fewer people defending Fort Niagara and the Niagara Frontier. Here's an aerial view of the fort. And you can see in the very center of the slide, you see the French castle. And this is where Betsy Doyle carried the shot up and down the stairways to the gun on the top level of the French castle there. So that's an aerial view of the fort. This would be a Times New Roman view of the Fort Niagara. I'm looking for differences, but I think that those differences are font indeed. And now a better view of the French castle. What was Betsy Doyle doing now? There's a few hundred soldiers in Fort Niagara. It's cold. The few militiamen there, a couple dozen, are shaking in their boots because they know that the new British general, General Gordon Drummond, is coming back with a vengeance, and he's going to attack Fort Niagara. Those are the rumors. And he's gathering his forces in and around Newark. Well, Betsy sees the militiamen shaking in their shoes, and she's going to shame them into their duty. So one evening for guard duty, she shows up and she's got on her overcoat and her boots and her heavy hat, and she straps on a cartridge box and she grabs a musket and she serves guard with these militiamen. Again, just shaming them into doing their duty. The next morning, she goes off to her home in Youngstown, where she and her 3 children are there. And that evening, the British will attack. And it's going to be a bayonet assault on Fort Niagara. The men are ordered to pull the flints out of their muskets. They will attack with the bayonet only. They don't want any soldier to accidentally trip and fire his weapon and give warning to the people inside of the fort. They come up on the fort stealthily. They bayonet the guards at the gate, and they find out that the gate is unlocked. The guards had left the gate unlocked. They swarm into the fort. They surprise the defenders. They attack with the bayonet. They go into the hospital, and even though the Americans are surrendering, the British soldiers are bayoneting them until their officers can bring them under control. The losses, 65 Americans are killed, over 300 are taken prisoner. The British lose 5 soldiers killed and 5 soldiers wounded in action. And Drummond is pleased with this, and he's going to follow up the destruction, the capture of Fort Niagara with an attack on the village of Lewiston. And now he introduces something new. He brings in 400 Western Indians, native warriors, who used to be fighting for Tecumseh. Tecumseh is now dead, but these warriors come from the West. They link up with the British Army, and they join in this attack. And this is going to utterly terrify the people in Lewiston because the attack comes at night with no warning, and the Indians enter Lewiston first with the British behind them. The people in Lewiston just grab whatever they can, abandon their homes, head east towards the Genesee River through the snowy woods on bad roads. They're evacuating as fast as they can. They think that the native warriors are on their tail and going to kill and or scalp them. The following day, the British attack Manchester with the same result. Manchester is the village that grows up to be Niagara Falls, New York. Now, Niagara County has about 6,000 residents in the census of 1810. And the journals and the letters basically say that everybody in Niagara County, all the civilians, headed east, fearing death and destruction. And Hamlet Scranton is in Rochester. He writes a letter and he describes these folks this way. Daily are passing here in sleighs and wagons, families deprived of their all, not a cent of money, no provision, no bedding, children barefoot, etc., all depending on the charity of the people. And now the attack on Black Rock and Buffalo. A few days later, Drummond attacks again, crosses the Niagara River, bringing again about 400 native warriors. They attack Black Rock from 2 directions. Black Rock's defended now because the New York militia has started showing up to defend the area. And there's a lot of them. There's about 2,500 militia called up in the cold weather rapidly. They've marched 40, 50, 100 miles to defend the Niagara Frontier. The British assault. Many of the militia will put up a fairly stout defense, but the majority of them, when they hear the Indians whooping and the British behind them with their bayonets, many of the militiamen basically turn and withdraw as fast as they can and head back home. So Black Rock is overrun. There is some killing of females, non-combatants. As the British approach Buffalo, Cyrenius Chapin meets them with a white flag, and he offers to surrender the village of Buffalo on the condition that the British will not burn down any of the houses, because that's what they've been doing over the past weeks. The British commander agrees to that, and then 2 things happen. First, he discovers that Chapin does not have the authority to surrender Buffalo because his commission has run out. His term of service is gone. He's just a private citizen with no authority to surrender. And secondly, there's a bunch of regular American soldiers in Williamsville. They know the attack's coming on. They're marching from Williamsville towards Buffalo. They don't know that the city's been surrendered. And the British commander sees them approaching. He thinks that the terms of surrender have been violated. And so he puts all houses to the torch except one. A widow in downtown Buffalo begs him to spare her home. He spares it, and that is the one house that is not burned down on the Niagara Frontier. So in this last bit of conflict, the last day of conflict, a lot of casualties, but the total of claims that were placed after the destruction were here: 183 houses, 72 barns, 66 stores and shops. This is far beyond what was destroyed in Newark. And this does not represent the total destruction. This is the destruction of for people who've actually submitted claims. A lot of the people in Niagara County left the county after this and never returned and did not submit any claims. Now, the picture there is what the New York militia might have looked like when they reported to BlackRock to defend that village. Okay, a lot of claims go in, but it's the Committee of Safety in the village of Canandaigua that takes the lead. They put out a circular letter to the people of New York asking for donations. Those donations come in. But one of the lines in their letter is this: mothers find themselves wandering with strange children, and children are seen accompanied by such as have no other sympathies with them than those of common sufferings. And so New York City, Albany, the state all kick in money. Eventually, the federal government will pay off the claims that weren't paid off by New York State. And so a lot of claims, a lot of grants, a lot of loans. And for the people who return to the Niagara Frontier to rebuild, they have the financial wherewithal to do so. Going back to Joseph Wilcox, bad things are happening in Canada. The Canadian authorities are finally rounding up their renegades, people that have aided and abetted the American invaders. They're bringing them to trial. Some are sentenced to jail. A lot of them are sentenced to be executed. And the traitors who are executed are hung, drawn, and quartered. Wilcox escapes all this. He's in New York. We will see him later in 1814 at the siege of Fort Erie. He's killed in a skirmish outside of the fort. He's buried in downtown Buffalo. And then in 1851, he is reinterred with a lot of the early people who have dead and been buried in Buffalo, reinterred in Forest Lawn Cemetery. As for Betsy Doyle, she had come back from guard duty that night the British attack. She grabs her 3 children, and with everyone else, she starts walking towards the east. She doesn't stop at the Genesee River. She walks all the way to Greenbush. Now, this is East Greenbush. It's on the other side of the Hudson River from Albany. It was a huge American cantonment area. Since she is still on the roster with the 1st Artillery, she can go there. She doesn't receive her husband's pay, and the commandant of the fort writes to the Secretary of War saying she needs the pay. She has children. Her husband is a POW, but the Department of War does not pay her. She will eventually die of disease in 1819. Now, Andrew Doyle is released from prison and repatriated to Boston. There he discovers what turns out to be an untruth, but he's told that Betsy is dead. He cannot locate his children. And so he, in 1819, he remarries, and he's actually married before Betsy passes away. Andrew lives a very long life. He passes away in his 70s. As for Dr. Chapin, he's taken prisoner at the burning of Buffalo, sent to Quebec as a prisoner of war. Remember, he's a civilian status. He's finally released. He puts in a claim for his pay while he was captured, and the War Department rejects it because he's no longer an officer. He was a civilian. Eventually, he moves back to Buffalo. He starts the forerunner, model citizen, leading citizen, starts what will become the Erie County Fair. He sets up the Medical Society for Erie County. Now, remember at this time, Erie County, during the war, Erie County did not exist. Erie County was part of Niagara County. It's after the war that that whole area of Western New York is split into Niagara County and Erie County. So now let's talk a little bit about my book that this presentation came from. The Burning of the Niagara Frontier is chapter 13 in the book. New York's War of 1812, Politics, Society, and Combat by the Oklahoma University Press. If you're interested, perhaps in getting this book, you can search oupress.com. In the search window, type in Barbuto. This book will pop up. Thick book, filled with a lot of detail, 364 pages, $40 for the hardcover. Now, in October, OU Press is putting this out in soft cover, and you can purchase it, pre-purchase it now for delivery in October. And that's enough of this shameless request for you to look at this book as a possible purchase. So now we're going to turn back to Richard Comstock for questioning.
Thank you, Rich. I want to emphasize that what you've seen is a snapshot of a chapter. I'll say a chapter and a half, but it has been building over the beginning of the book, and really I think gives not only a great snapshot of the confusion that existed, but also just the desperation of many of the U.S. soldiers and citizens during that war. I think that it's clear that Madison was concerned. James Madison, our president at the time, was concerned with the British interference with shipping. And it's interesting that he pushed for a declaration of war. He did it the right, quote, the right way. He went to Congress and he got Congress to buy into a war, which in hindsight from today, we could say, you know, that's the way you do it. But I guess the question, Rich, is that, you know, do you think that he was really prepared? I mean, given the fact that he was pushing for it, was he really prepared, either personally, militarily, logistically, what have you, for waging a war?
Real good question. James Madison, very diminutive man, weighs about 100 pounds, dripping wet, but he's got a 10-pound brain. This is the guy who helped write our Constitution, which has survived for over 200 years. Very cerebral, very theoretical, but not prepared to wage war. He's not a war president. He's got no military background. His choice for general officers, for generals, he picks old Revolutionary War soldiers. They're old, they have no energy, they've not kept up with the changes in warfare. These are leaders such as William Hull, Henry Dearborn, Morgan Lewis, a former governor of New York, James Wilkinson. And then he failed to align their authority or to define their authority and their responsibilities. So some of these generals really didn't know what they were responsible for or how much authority they had. Madison trusted that the war would be popular enough that thousands of people would volunteer for service to do the initial fighting. And in this, he was sadly disappointed. Volunteers showed up in the hundreds, not the thousands. Madison didn't understand where the war would take place, not really. He wished away the overwhelming logistical challenge, particularly of moving people and supplies over long distances over poor roads. And militarily, he utterly failed to comprehend the need to dominate the lakes and the rivers along the border. He did not build up the Navy to own those lakes from the Royal Navy, and America had to fight for them. So those are the charges I would have against James Madison. There's probably some more, but he was not fit to be a wartime leader.
Rich, having spent a portion of my time in the military and the National Guard, I was confused, amazed, I guess, and a whole lot of other emotions when I read about the federal troops, the common militia, the local militia, and how they all fit together, or didn't fit together, as the case may be. And if you could just give us a little bit of insight on that, if you could, and we're gonna go from that into a discussion of not only the Native American participation, but also Daniel Tompkins.
Well, the administration failed to enlist the number of regulars it needed to pursue this war, these war aims. This is our first foreign war. We have to invade Canada, take Montreal, take Quebec. But in the regular army, the pay was poor, and the term of enlistment was initially 5 years. Now, who wants to sign up for that? Now, eventually, Congress is going to lower the term of enlistment and increase the bonus that soldiers will get when they enlist. But that happens later in the war when the Americans realize that they're not winning this war. So fewer and fewer people were willing to become regular soldiers. Now, the administration failed to build regulations that smoothed out the issues between the regular army and the militia. For example, Army paymasters were very reluctant to pay militia after their terms of service expired. So the militia end up 90 days away from home. Their families are running the farm on their own, and they're not paid when they leave. Now, who among them is going to volunteer for service when they know that it's going to be months, if ever, that they get paid? And one of my favorite examples, the commander of Fort Niagara at the beginning of the war refused to let the militia inside the fort because the fort was federal property and the militia were the soldiers of the governor, even though they had been brought onto federal service. The administration fed soldiers by contractors. The contractors had to secure the food and move it to where the soldiers were. Everyone is competing for wagons and teams. And so when the food arrives at the soldiers, if it arrives at all, a lot of the flour is bad and the pork and the beef are spoiled. So oftentimes the soldiers had poor or no food, and this happened throughout the war. Transportation was very slow and very costly. So even though shoes and uniforms are prepared in Philadelphia and New York, it takes months to get them to the front. And that first winter, a lot of the soldiers are serving in their summer lightweight uniforms. So overall, yeah, the administration is pretty much unprepared for its first major war.
It is quite astounding. To add another layer of complexity to this, the Native American, and this was a point of confusion for me, which I think was a point of confusion for everyone on the ground as well, is which tribe, if you will, or nation was on whose side. And I know that was a source of unending uncertainty for the United States in particular.
Right. Well, we need to understand that Native Americans, they made war for their own reasons. Now, at a personal level, someone might want to demonstrate his military prowess as a warrior. He might want plunder, something to take home. And I'm not saying that the Indians are the only plunderers. Soldiers on both sides plundered civilian homes when they had the opportunity. It was very unfortunate. Now, at the tribal level, if you're living in Canada, you want to maintain good relations with the British government. If you're the Iroquois in New York, you want to maintain decent relations with the American government. And if you're out west, you want to push back the white settlers. These are Americans moving into the west. So for any number of reasons, different tribes will come, or clans or individuals will come into the war for their very own reasons. Now, what they bring to the war is this: besides being great scouts, it's terror. They can terrorize the whites who have heard all the stories from the American Revolution, how the Mohawk Valley was depopulated because of Native Americans carrying on war with the settlers. They know all those stories. And when they hear the war whoops, they want to drop their weapon and seek safety. This happens at the Battle of Queenston Heights, and it happens at the village of Lewiston. What triggers the people on the Niagara Frontier to flee into the snowy wilderness is the thought that right on their heels will be some Indian warrior trying to take their scalp. And it's that terror that gives them so much ability far beyond their numbers, if you will.
Thank you. This leads me to a discussion of a very interesting fellow and a very busy fellow, and that's Daniel Tompkins. Thank you, Rich, for pointing out the obvious that was the extent of ours being New York State's border with Canada and what that meant, not only as it related to across the St. Lawrence River, across Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. It was significant. And Tompkins found himself to be very busy, not only in the appointment of commanders, but also in geographically busy in the sense that not only did he have to worry about a border with Canada, but he also had to worry about New York City and the defense of the harbor at New York City, which was also significant. And I would ask you just, I know you've alluded to it in your presentation, but just quickly, whatever you might want to add about Daniel Tompkins and his participation, if you will, or non-participation of the other states in this conflict.
Right. Daniel Tompkins is one of the least known of New York's governors. Even though he's the first war governor, he takes New York through the war. He becomes vice president of the United States. He's the first vice president to serve for a full 8 years. And the environment, when he comes to office in 1807, the environment, political environment, you think today there's a problem between Democrats and Republicans. Doesn't compare to what was going on in New York between the Federalists and the Republicans. And of course, this Republican, the people who call themselves Republicans then, has no association with the current Republican Party. It's a different group, same name. Neither side would allow the other side to win anything. There were physical fights where people were beaten and kicked on the streets of Albany, for example, because of some careless word in the state assembly. And Tompkins has to negotiate all of this. And very often the assembly is a Federalist assembly. He's a Republican governor in a state that the purse strings are held by the Federalists. But as soon as he takes office in 1807, he persuades the legislature to start purchasing weapons, muskets, that are brought into the state. They're manufactured in Connecticut and in Massachusetts. And he starts putting them in arsenals. And he starts moving arsenals much closer to the border so that the people on the border will have quick access to weapons. He starts the fortifications of New York City in a very careful cooperative in New York City between the Federalists and the Republican leadership, as well as the federal government, in building fortifications. And New York City is never attacked during the war. The British see the fortifications going up and would rather attack Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So New York is left alone largely because of the efforts of Governor Tompkins in getting the city fortified. He looks at the militia organization, and as the population of the state grows, he expands the militia organization. He makes sure that good people, for the most part, as near as he can tell, the good people are the officers of the militia. He charters volunteer companies of people who provide their own uniforms and weapons and who will volunteer for the war, and they do during the war, and give great service. Interestingly enough, I found out that as militia officers are taking their battalions of militia and marching to the front, the borders, they pass through Albany. There, the governor gives them funds to feed their troops until the contractors can eventually feed them. And when he runs out of state funds, he takes his own money and hands it to the battalion commanders, just on a receipt to collect later on. Tompkins is the first governor of the state who's not part of the New York aristocracy. His dad was a farmer. He put himself through Columbia, joins politics and meteoric rise to the governorship. He's not a wealthy man. In fact, when he dies, he will be penniless. He will owe money when he finally passes away. But you alluded to the state governors that don't support the war. This is all the state governors in New England. Federalists refuse to support the war, do not cooperate with federal authorities. And in fact, the governor of Massachusetts is going to open up a treasonous correspondence with the governor of New Brunswick, talking about the possibility of secession of Massachusetts or perhaps all of New England towards the end of the war, and would Britain help defend them in case the other states were trying to bring them back into the Union. So yeah, there's treason, but certainly a high level of non-cooperation in the war. So that's pretty much it for the governorships. Governor Tompkins, I think, is the unsung hero, and the governors of New England, not so much.
Having come from Ithaca, New York, and Tompkins County, obviously, he caught my attention and my interest. I think the final question that I have is basically your chapter on the burning of Newark and the resulting burning of the Niagara Frontier basically seems to me to be a perfect storm. Everything that could go wrong, everything that was mismanaged, not only from the treatment of the troops, but the failure to communicate, the appointment of less than competent leadership, the issue of these tiers of federal versus militia, all come into play, and as is the impact of the Native American, all come into play in this one chapter. And I think you've built beautifully into that chapter in the preceding part of the book. So just any comments you have on that. Again, you've covered it well, but any final comments you might have on that before we take questions from you,
Richard. I think you're exactly right. Problems at the federal and state level, such as poor leadership and poor relations between the regulars and the militia, allowed this catastrophe to happen. Winfield Scott abandons the Niagara Frontier in search of glory. The militia is allowed to depart Fort George before the next wave of militia arrives to defend Fort George. McClure was a weak leader. He intentionally exceeded his orders in burning Newark. It was entirely uncalled for. The officers in Fort Niagara are culpable too. They're not checking their guards, who left the main gate of this major fort unlocked, allowing the quick victory the British have in Fort Niagara. And when the militia is called up to defend Black Rock and Buffalo, too many of them would not stand up and fight. And I'm not going to be critical of them. That's just a commentary that the militia in this day and age sometimes didn't have the stomach or the training or the experience to get in a face-to-face combat with either native warriors or with British regulars. But I have to add that General Drummond, the British commander, he far exceeded any sense of proportionality in his retaliation. Retaliation was legal. Newark lost 40 or 50 houses, and the people had to move several miles to find shelter. Drummond far exceeded that. He had an ulterior motive. He knew that eventually the American soldiers would return to the Niagara Frontier, and they would be quartered in these barns and houses. He wanted to make sure there was absolutely no shelter left along the Niagara Frontier, and hopefully that would buy him some time before the Americans dared to cross the Niagara River again. So I think I hope that answers your question in telescoping down how problems at the upper levels show up catastrophically at the local level.
Thank you. One thing I'll mention before we turn it over for questions, part of your book, which I also found very fascinating, besides the harbor defenses in New York City, was just the whole naval conflict on Lake, specifically on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. So I urge anyone who's interested in the war, or even if you're not, you'll become interested in the war if you read this book, because it does do a really good job of talking about the various aspects of our involvement, which I think are significant. I'm going to turn it back to Jose for the questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Rich and Richard. We have a lot of questions. So I'm going to start with kind of a meaty one that hopefully knits together a few of the questions. And it's basically about how this fighting impacted the daily lives of people actually living there, and how I'm always interested also in how sometimes the sides are not as clearly defined when you're living in close quarters with people, and they're more malleable. So how did the fighting impact locals on both sides of the river? And were there British loyalists on the US side? And if so, how did that work? So I'm going to pass that one to Rich.
Well, great questions. Of course, if you lived on the frontier, you were constantly worried that you were going to be personally involved in the fighting, and you had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. But let's look at the people in, for example, Albany or New York or any of the other larger cities. The British put a blockade on the port of New York and Long Island Sound. The cities depended upon food. Now, this is before the days of the Erie Canal, so they're getting a lot of their food from the East Coast. And so you've got the shipping along the Atlantic coast to feed these big cities. With the British and Canadian privateers, as well as the Royal Navy, they're shutting down most of the traffic. So the price of food is skyrocketing. Likewise, the shipment of coal to keep the people in New York City warm in the wintertime, those shipments are being cut down. So prices are going up. There's inflation. A lot of food and other necessaries just aren't arriving. Now, there aren't too many British sympathizers in the area. Most of these were thrown out of the state after the American Revolution. But there's a lot of Federalists. And in the newspapers everywhere, the Federalists are criticizing the war, criticizing James Madison. There are people that are refusing to show up for militia duty. Now, there is no draft. There's no conscription. But when the governor calls out the militia of some town, for example, and only half the people show up, and those people aren't armed, except for a few of them that might happen to have a shotgun or whatever, militarily, they're not very useful. And so this is going on through much of the state. The good news, I guess, is at the end of the war, we now have trade with the British Empire that we didn't have before. So a lot of this will go away. But during the war, there were some hard times.
So that actually segues nicely into one of our other questions, which is about the soldiers and where they came from, which parts of the state, and even did they come from other parts of the country?
Oh, good. There are 48 regiments formed in the regular army. 6 of them, and I cover this all in the book, 6 of them are dedicated to New York State. 3 of them are going to be assigned to New York City. And the federal government will also form 2 regiments of volunteers. These are people who sign up for a single year. And they're not going to get land at the end of their service like a regular soldier will get. He'll get land. And so New York City has upwards on 5 regiments of soldiers. The city is pretty much militarized. The good news about the soldiers in New York City is they're pretty much told, we're not going to send you to the frontier. Your job is to defend the city and to live in those fortifications that we're building. Now, the other New York regiments are up on the frontier, and they're fighting right from day one of the war. A lot of soldiers enlist in the New York City area, which has about 10% of the population of the state. And when the blockade comes, a lot of people lose their jobs. And so for many people in New York, they've lost their job. Where can you get a job right away? You become a soldier. And so at least they're being fed and paid for the duration of the war, even though the soldiers in New York City are never really called upon to fight. Unlike the soldiers up on the frontiers who are in battle after battle after battle. I might add, let me add this, and the book covers it pretty well. There's a revolution in Ireland in 1798, and the leaders of the Irish revolt, they're being tried, executed, imprisoned. A lot of them escape to America, come to both Boston and New York City, don't like the British, and they form particularly effective leadership of volunteer battalions and regiments that fight throughout the war. A lot of the leadership in the Army comes from folks either born in Ireland, who came over earlier, or as a result of the revolution in 1798.
That's really interesting. You mentioned the population of New York City. We had a question, quick one about do you know what the population of Buffalo was at the time?
Oh gosh, in the village itself, roughly 500. But remember, on the frontier, roughly 15% of the people would live in a village, and the other 85% own their individual farms. So the vastly rural population on isolated farms throughout the state. I might add this, the effect on the state, the farmers of the Mohawk Valley and elsewhere thought that they had lost their market for grain, and it was hard getting down to New York City. But since the Army put so many troops on the frontier, they had a wonderful market for grain, feeding the troops on the frontier. So for them, it was actually an economic boon.
So we actually have quite a few questions about people returning after the burning of the frontier. Were the Americans able to return and recover from the burning to retake the fort, or what was the conclusion of that? Right.
An awful lot returned. We don't have, and I think a minority stayed away from the Niagara Frontier. It was just too dangerous for them. We don't have good numbers. The Holland Land Company was selling the land in Western New York. We would have to go to the records are kept in Batavia. Someone would have to go there and look at who's signing for what land and when they gave up their claim or stopped paying, and who might have acquired their property. I think an accountant would have to look at the records to find out exactly how many families returned, and then look at the census to see how many people were in each of the families. So it would be quite a job to answer that question.
One question we had is, you mentioned some of the difficulties in getting men and supplies to the Niagara Frontier. Was that any part of the reasoning for building the Erie Canal?
Well, the plans to build the Erie Canal were developed before the war. There was a committee at the state level who tried to work out a route. And actually the war did two things. It threw those plans, the state couldn't work on the Erie Canal during the war, just couldn't do it. But it was an impetus, I think, a further impetus for DeWitt Clinton to go ahead and push through his plans to build it. A lot of people wanted to live out west in New York. There's good land out there, and in central New York, and the Erie Canal, of course, opened all of that and opened up the markets in both directions. The markets for the people on the frontier weren't with New York City, they were with Montreal. If you're in Sackett's Harbor or Ogdensburg, you're not trading with New York merchants, you're trading with Montreal merchants. after the Erie Canal is put in, the people on Lake Ontario, now they're trading south. They're not trading with Canada so much.
So we are sort of running out of time here, but there's one last question that I want to pitch to you, and I'm just going to read it directly the way the person phrased it, because it's an interesting question. Pierre Burton argues that the war did much to create a sense of Canadian identity. In the aftermath of the war, did New Yorkers view the war in terms of the lost opportunity to expand across the Niagara frontier?
Oh, what a great question. No, Pierre Burton, oh gosh, I love reading his work. For the Canadians, the War of 1812, that's their American Revolution. That's where they get started as a nation and come together as a nation. New York, harder to say, there is a great burst of patriotism, not only in New York, but throughout the whole country, for a couple of reasons. In New York, and I've got a whole chapter on the Battle of Plattsburgh. We defend the Lake Champlain area in the village of Plattsburgh in an astounding victory, one that probably should not have happened. So certainly in upper New York, they take great satisfaction for that conflict. In Buffalo, hard to say. The war's a forgotten war, so let's start from there. Interestingly, though, besides the Battle of Plattsburgh, why there's such a burst of patriotism and nationalism in New York after the war actually comes from the Battle of New Orleans. America doesn't find out that the war is over until February, about the same time that the results of the Battle of New Orleans reaches New York City. So on the one hand, you get an astounding victory in New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, and the peace treaty arrives. Well, in America, you conflate those two ideas. We beat the British in New Orleans, and therefore we won the war. And so what do you feel? Well, you feel a sense of pride for your military accomplishments, I guess.
Well, thank you so much. There are some questions that we didn't get to, and a number of people did ask about whether there would be some follow-up materials sent. We will send an email at the after the presentation that will contain some other information. This session is also recorded, so the recording will be available on our website, and all of that information will be in the follow-up email. But I want to thank you, Rich, and you, Richard, very much for joining us today. And I want to thank everybody who attended today's presentation for joining us. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. And if you're interested in the content we create and you'd like some more of it, please email us at aptrust@nysed.gov. And we will send you a free past issue of New York Archives, which is not to be missed. Also, please join us on June 7th at 12:30 for our next New York Archives Magazine online speaker series entitled History Education, Bringing History Organizations and Educators Together. Learn more about efforts to build a statewide network of historians, archivists, and educators for the promotion of authentic history education that elevates the voices of the underrepresented, uses historical records, and develops the next generation of active and engaged New York State citizens via considerthesourcenewyork.org. You can find more information about that and all of our other programs, including the magazine, at www.nysarchivestrust.org. And I just want to say thank you so much once again, Rich and Richard, for a wonderful presentation.